December 1941. Winter light filters through the tall windows of the Bureau of Ordnance headquarters in Washington, D.C., illuminating conference tables where naval officers examine blueprints and technical specifications. The Mark 14 Torpedo sits in their minds as a triumph of American engineering. 21 feet long, carrying a 663-pound warhead powered by a steam turbine that could drive it 27 miles at 46 knots. The weapon had passed every test the Navy could devise. Mathematical calculations proved its depth control was precise. Laboratory trials confirmed the Mark 6 magnetic exploder would detonate beneath an enemy ship's keel, breaking its back with a single blow. Contact tests showed the backup exploder would finish any target the magnetic feature missed. The Bureau's confidence was absolute. This was not mere optimism, but institutional certainty, built on years of design work and controlled trials. The Torpedo had been accepted into service in 1938 after exhaustive non-destructive testing. Every component had been analyzed, every system validated, every specification confirmed. Theodore Roscoe would later write in the official Navy history that the service was convinced its testing was adequate when it had performed none of the validation that mattered most. The one test the Navy had not conducted was the only one that counted. No Mark 14 had ever been fired in anger against an actual enemy hull. No live warhead had ever been detonated against real ship steel under combat conditions. The weapon existed in a realm of theoretical perfection, where laboratory precision substituted for battlefield proof. In 3 weeks, Pearl Harbor would burn, and America would go to war with a torpedo the Navy believed was ready. The Bureau of Ordnance would soon discover that institutional confidence was not the same as combat effectiveness, and that 21 months of failure lay ahead before one submarine captain would force them to admit the truth. The collision between American certainty and Pacific reality was about to begin. January 1942. Across the Pacific, American submarines began their war patrols carrying Mark 14 torpedoes into combat for the first time. The early reports should have been a warning. USS Sargo fired 13 torpedoes at a Japanese convoy and watched them detonate prematurely or miss targets that should have been easy kills. USS Sea Dragon put 4 torpedoes into a stationary tanker and saw 3 fail to explode. USS Gudgeon's captain reported perfect firing solutions that produced no results. The pattern repeated across patrol after patrol. Submarine commanders described torpedoes that ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Others detonated early, exploding in the water short of their intended victims. Worst of all came the reports of direct hits that produced no explosion at all. Torpedoes striking enemy hulls with audible impacts but failing to detonate, leaving targets damaged but afloat. The pattern was unmistakable. The Bureau refused to see it. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Southwest Pacific, began collecting these reports with growing alarm. The combat record was building a case that something was fundamentally wrong with America's primary submarine weapon. In Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance maintained its position. The torpedo was sound. The problem was not the weapon, but the men firing it. The Bureau of Ordnance was not just a testing agency, but a design authority with its reputation tied to the weapons it produced. Admitting the Mark 14 was defective meant acknowledging that years of development work and millions of dollars in production had been wasted. More damaging still, it meant confessing that the Navy had sent submarines into combat with a weapon that did not function as advertised. The Bureau's response was to blame the crews. Submarine captains were missing their targets, miscalculating firing solutions, or failing to maintain their weapons properly. The torpedo itself was not at fault. This institutional denial created a feedback loop of failure. Combat reports accumulated at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle, but Washington dismissed them as operational errors rather than design defects. Submarine commanders found themselves caught between the evidence of their own eyes and the official insistence that their weapon was reliable. Some began to doubt their own competence. Others developed elaborate workarounds, firing more torpedoes than doctrine called for, or approaching targets at closer range to compensate for perceived aiming errors. The cost was measured not in dramatic single battles, but in the steady hemorrhage of missed opportunities. Japanese convoys that should have been destroyed continue to deliver supplies to forward bases. Tankers carrying aviation fuel reached their destinations intact. Troop transports completed their voyages without interference. Clay Blair's analysis in Silent Victory estimates that roughly 800,000 to 1 million tons of Japanese shipping escaped destruction during 1942 and early 1943 because American torpedoes were not functioning reliably. Lockwood's first breakthrough came in the summer of 1942. Working from his headquarters in Fremantle, Western Australia, he authorized tests that the Bureau had been reluctant to conduct. Submarines fired Mark 14s at specific depth settings through submerged nets in Frenchman Bay near Albany. The results were visible and undeniable. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet were actually running at 25 feet. Those set for 20 feet were running at 35 feet. The depth control mechanism was systematically faulty, causing torpedoes to pass beneath their targets without making contact. The evidence was photographic. Holes in the nets showed exactly where the torpedoes had passed, and the pattern proved the weapons were running 10 to 15 feet deeper than their settings indicated. Faced with this physical proof, the Bureau finally acknowledged the first defect. New depth tables were issued in August 1942, correcting for the control error. 1 defect down, 2 to go. Fixing the depth problem only revealed the second defect. With torpedoes now running at their proper depth, submarine commanders reported a new pattern of failure. The Mark 6 magnetic exploder was detonating prematurely, triggered by the magnetic fields of the submarine's own hulls, or by variations in the Earth's magnetic field in different parts of the Pacific. Torpedoes exploded in the water short of their targets, creating spectacular but harmless geysers. The magnetic exploder had been designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, where the explosion would break the vessel's back more effectively than a contact hit against the side. In theory, this was devastating. In practice, the magnetic sensor was too sensitive and too unreliable for combat use. It responded to magnetic anomalies that had nothing to do with enemy ships, wasting torpedoes on false triggers. Admiral Ernest King finally ordered Pacific Fleet submarines to deactivate the magnetic feature on June 24, 1943. This was an institutional admission that a key component of America's primary submarine weapon could not be trusted in combat. 18 months into the war, the Navy was backing away from technology it had spent years developing and had declared combat ready without adequate testing. Even with the depth control corrected and the magnetic exploder deactivated, the torpedo crisis was not over. Submarine commanders continued to report direct hits that failed to explode. Perfect firing solutions at close range against stationary or slow-moving targets still produced duds. The contact exploder, supposedly the weapon's most reliable backup system, was also failing. The breakthrough that would finally force the Navy to confront this third defect was already approaching. In the Truk to Rabaul shipping lane, USS Tinosa was closing on a target that would provide the clearest possible proof that America's torpedo was broken in ways the Bureau had never imagined. This is where the dam broke. July 24, 1943. The tropical sun beats down on calm Pacific waters in the Truk to Rabaul shipping lane. USS Tinosa, a Gato-class submarine on her third war patrol, moves through the blue water under the command of Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Randall Daspit. The sea state is flat, Visibility unlimited. The kind of conditions a submarine commander waits an entire career for. Ahead lies the Japanese whale factory ship Tonan Maru No. 3, 19,262 tons of converted Norwegian whaler, now serving as an oil tanker for the Imperial Navy. The massive vessel sits motionless in the water, listing and burning from an earlier torpedo attack that had forced her escorts to withdraw. Smoke rises from her superstructure, but the hull remains intact. She is a sitting target in perfect conditions. Daspit brings Tinosa to attack position and fires his first spread. 4 Mark 14 torpedoes streak toward the stationary tanker. 2 find their mark and detonate, sending columns of flame and debris skyward. The explosions confirm what every submarine commander knew in theory. When the Mark 14 worked, it was devastatingly effective. Yet 2 torpedoes in the spread fail to explode, despite striking their target. The tanker settles lower in the water, but remains afloat. Her escorts have fled, leaving the burning hulk alone on the empty ocean. Daspit faces a decision that will change the course of the Pacific Submarine War. He could claim a successful attack and return to base. 2 hits on the major target would satisfy most patrol requirements. Instead, he chooses to investigate why half his torpedoes had failed to detonate. What followed would become the most documented weapon failure in submarine history. Daspit closes to point-blank range, bringing Tinosa to within 875 yards of the burning tanker. The geometry is perfect, a perpendicular approach against a motionless target in flat water. Every variable that could cause a torpedo to miss has been eliminated. No evasive maneuvering, no rough seas, no speed calculations, no bearing errors, just a submarine, a target, and the weapons that should destroy it. He fires again. The torpedo runs straight and true, striking the tanker's hull with an audible impact. No explosion. Daspit fires a second torpedo, with the same result. A third. A fourth. Each weapon hits the target cleanly and fails to detonate. The sound of metal striking metal carries across the water, but the expected blast never comes. This is how submarine torpedo attacks actually worked in combat. A submarine commander had to calculate the target's speed, course, and range, while managing his own boat's position and depth. He fired torpedoes in spreads, hoping that even if his calculations were slightly off, at least one weapon would find its mark. The entire tactical system was built on the assumption that a torpedo hitting its target would explode. When that assumption proved false, the entire doctrine collapsed. Daspit continues firing, each shot a controlled experiment in the failure of American ordnance. The 5th torpedo hits without exploding. The 6th does the same. By now, any doubt about his marksmanship has been eliminated. These are not misses, but mechanical failures of the contact exploder itself. The 7th torpedo strikes the hull and fails. The 8th produces another dud. The 9th torpedo adds to the count of failures. Daspit fires his 10th torpedo at the helpless tanker. Another hit. Another failure to detonate. The 11th torpedo strikes home without exploding. 12 torpedoes have now hit their target, and only the first 2 have functioned as designed. The pattern is beyond dispute. The Mark 14's contact exploder is failing on direct hits. The 12th torpedo adds to the count of duds. The 13th strikes,
and fails to explode. Daspit has now fired 15 Mark 14 torpedoes at a single stationary target. All 15 have hit. Only 2 have detonated. 13 perfect hits have produced 13 failures. Daspit makes a decision that will reverberate through the Navy's command structure. He retains his last torpedo as physical evidence and orders Tinosa back to Pearl Harbor. His patrol report will contain a single, devastating sentence that the Bureau of Ordnance cannot dismiss or explain away. The technical reality behind Daspit's experience was more complex than anyone realized. The Mark 14 torpedo suffered from 3 independent defects, each capable of causing failure on its own. Frederick Milford's later analysis would describe them as stacked problems. The depth control error that made torpedoes run too deep, the magnetic exploder that detonated prematurely or not at all, and the contact exploder that failed on direct hits.
The contact exploder's weakness lay in its firing pin guide rails. Made of soft cast aluminum, these components were supposed to guide the firing pin into the detonator when the torpedo struck its target. On high-angle impacts against steel hulls, the guide rails crushed before the firing pin could complete its travel. The harder the hit, the more likely the failure. Perfect shots were actually the worst-case scenario for detonation. This inverted the Navy's understanding of torpedo performance. Bureau of Ordnance officials had assumed that closer range and better aim would improve results. In reality, the contact exploder was most likely to fail precisely when the attack was most skillfully executed. Submarine commanders who followed doctrine and pressed home their attacks were being punished by their own weapons. Daspit's patrol report reaches ComSubPac headquarters at Pearl Harbor with the force of a bombshell. Of 15 torpedoes fired at this target, all hit, only 2 exploded. I cannot account for this. The arithmetic is simple and devastating. 15 shots, 15 hits, 2 explosions, 13 duds. No amount of institutional denial can explain away numbers this stark. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific, recognizes the significance immediately. Daspit's report is not another complaint about poor torpedo performance, but documented proof that the weapon is fundamentally defective. The controlled conditions of the attack eliminate every excuse the Bureau has offered for 20 months of combat failures. Lockwood forwards the report to Admiral Chester Nimitz with his own assessment. The torpedo crisis can no longer be blamed on submarine crews or combat conditions. The weapon itself is failing in ways that make effective submarine warfare impossible. Something must be done, and it must be done immediately. Nimitz authorizes what the Bureau of Ordnance has resisted for 2 years. Live fire testing of the Mark 14 under combat conditions. The tests will be conducted at Kahualave, Hawaii, using actual warheads against steel targets designed to simulate ship hulls. For the first time since the torpedo entered service, the Navy will test its primary submarine weapon the way it should have been tested before the war began. The Kahualave tests begin on August 31, 1943. Vice Admiral Lockwood personally oversees the trials, working alongside Captain Charles Momsen and Commander Art Taylor. Mark 14 warheads are dropped from 90 feet onto steel plates, reproducing the impact angles and forces of actual torpedo strikes. The test conditions are designed to isolate the contact exploder's performance under realistic combat stress. The results confirm Daspit's combat experience. Of 10 test drops, 7 fail to detonate. The contact exploder is indeed failing on direct hits, crushed by the very impacts it is supposed to detect. The Navy's backup detonation system, the component that was supposed to ensure target destruction even if the magnetic exploder failed, is itself unreliable. The fix follows quickly once the problem is acknowledged. The soft-cast aluminum guide rails are replaced with stronger machined steel components. The redesigned contact exploder can survive the impact forces that had been crushing its predecessor. Fleet-wide retrofit begins immediately, with priority given to submarines about to depart on patrol. By late September 1943, the Mark 14 torpedo finally functions as originally intended. The depth control runs true, the magnetic exploder has been deactivated, and the contact exploder detonates reliably on impact. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American submarines carry weapons that work. The transformation in submarine effectiveness is immediate and dramatic. Japanese shipping losses surge in the fourth quarter of 1943 as American submarines finally unleash their full destructive potential. Convoys that had been surviving torpedo attacks with minimal damage now face weapons that kill with single hits. The submarine blockade of Japan, stalled for nearly 2 years by defective ordnance, finally begins to strangle the Japanese war economy. The Mark 14 torpedo crisis stands as one of the most damaging institutional failures in American military history. For 21 months, the United States Navy sent its submarines into combat with weapons that did not work, while insisting the problem lay with the men firing them. The cost was measured not just in missed targets, but in prolonged war, continued Japanese resistance, and American lives lost to an enemy that should have been strangled much earlier. Vice Admiral Lockwood's retrospective judgment was harsh but accurate. We had sent our submariners into combat with a torpedo that didn't work. The Bureau of Ordnance had told us they did. They were wrong, and our crews paid for the error in blood and burned out boats for nearly 2 years. The corrected Mark 14 would go on to sink over 4 million tons of Japanese shipping and 201 Imperial Navy warships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and 11 cruisers. These victories came at the cost of 52 American submarines lost in combat. The final tally proved that when American submarines had weapons that worked, they were devastatingly effective against Japanese maritime power. The numbers also reveal the scandal's true cost. If the torpedo had been properly tested before the war, if the Bureau had acknowledged combat reports instead of dismissing them, if institutional pride had not overruled battlefield evidence, the submarine campaign could have achieved these results 18 months earlier. The Pacific War might have ended in 1944 instead of 1945. The Tinosa attack that forced this reckoning lasted less than 2 hours on a single day in July 1943. 15 torpedoes, 13 failures, and one captain's insistence on preserving evidence broke through 21 months of institutional denial. Lieutenant Commander Daspit's decision to retain that final torpedo and document exactly what had happened gave the Navy proof it could no longer ignore. The Bureau of Ordnance had entered the war confident that American engineering and testing had produced the world's most advanced submarine torpedo. They ended it having learned that confidence without validation is not strength, but dangerous delusion. The Mark 14 worked perfectly in theory and failed catastrophically in practice. Until one submarine captain forced the Navy to admit what its own combat reports had been saying for nearly 2 years. If you have any family stories about the Pacific War or know someone who served on submarines during World War II, I would genuinely love to hear about that in the comments below. Stories like Daspit's only survive because people remember them, and there are thousands more still waiting to be told. If you want to see how this submarine campaign actually unfolded once the torpedoes started working, the next video on screen breaks down the Pacific Submarine War that finally strangled Japan. Click it now.